On Super Bowl weekend, the world's biggest news was coming out of the Asia Pacific. Jimmy Lai, the 78-year-old jailed Hong Kong publisher, gets a 20-year prison sentence. What does it mean for both his freedom, potentially, and U.S.-China relations? Plus, Japan's new Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, led her Liberal Democratic Party to a landslide victory in legislative elections. The result will strengthen her hand in relations with both the U.S. and China.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome to Potomac Watch, the daily podcast of Wall Street Journal Opinion. I'm Paul Gigot, and I'm here with Bill McGurn and Joe Sternberg, a pair of old Asia hands, spent many years living in Asia. So after a 23-month trial and after 5 years in prison, Jimmy Lai gets what is essentially a death sentence. With 20 years in prison, he is 78 years old and in ill health and will undoubtedly die in prison unless he is released. Let's listen to his son, Sebastian, talk about the sentence and the case against his father on the BBC.
I think it's, obviously devastating, but it's also a tremendous faux pas. It's not the smart move because you've essentially destroyed your legal system. You've essentially decided to weaponize a legal system to go after a man who's a hero to many around the world, to destroy his newspaper, to arrest a few of his colleagues, and there's no benefit to it because after 5 years, after a tremendously long trial, they have found nothing. They have found a man who has given everything that he has for freedom. There's no there's no evidence that incriminate him. So Hong Kong now has spent this tremendous amount of money, destroyed what was its competitive advantage, a very strong legal system, to go after my father and have nothing to show for it.
Well, Bill, the conviction was, in this case, was for violating the territory's national security law, which was imposed by China on Hong Kong several years ago. Are you surprised by the brutality of the sentence, which is essentially a death sentence in prison unless Jimmy Lai is released?
I think no one is surprised. The one thing about Chinese law, people say it's unpredictable. It's very predictable. What the government wants, the government gets. And you and I were both talking about this years ago when the trial started. Everyone knew what the outcome is. That said, it's still a gut punch for the family and for Jimmy when you hear it come down from the judge, the finality and closing of chapter. It's still really a gut punch to the people who support him. There are some Apple Daily, his former paper, workers who went to the courtroom to support Jimmy. Kind of incredible in this atmosphere.
Yeah, it was a demonstration of real bravery on their part because they will be targeted by the government and watched very closely.
Yeah, Paul, I just want to say I read one account just of one person who was led away because she had an Apple Daily keychain or something. I think they didn't let her in. I don't know what happened to her, but that's how sensitive they are.
On the evidence, Bill, I saw a statement by the Chinese government foreign ministry saying today that he was justly convicted because he was the mastermind of the anti-government demonstrations in Hong Kong several years back. But as you and I know, Jimmy was no mastermind of anything except as a publisher who wanted to promote democracy in Hong Kong and wanted the Chinese government to live up to the promises it made to the British government and to Hong Kong in 1984 in the joint declaration that Margaret Thatcher, then the Prime Minister of Britain, signed, promising that there would be autonomy for Hong Kong for 50 years between 1997 and 2047. And all that has been essentially gutted by if not before this, certainly this is the final demonstration that the Hong Kong legal system is now a wholly owned subsidiary of China.
You were there in 1984. You remember the euphoria. And I think you wrote a very unpopular editorial expressing some doubts about it.
I did. In fact, Margaret Thatcher was particularly unhappy with that editorial.
If anything, reading it today is very modest. Everything it said is true and has come true, sadly. What Jimmy Lai wanted, Jimmy Lai was no more than a vigorous newspaper publisher. Met with a lot of people. He was a moderate in his goals. He was always against Hong Kong independence and things like that, that people would cockamamie things people would try to float. And he was actually the voice of reason in a lot of ways. And he wanted to preserve the freedom that allowed people like him to flourish. Ordinary people came to Hong Kong without a nickel and allowed them to grow rich and raise families and so forth. And that's all been threatened now. And even though, as I say, even though we all knew it was coming, it's still a punch in the gut to realize how this marks the end of an era.
So I think the severity of the sentence in part is just the sheer vindictiveness of China because of the symbol of freedom that Jimmy Lai has become. But he refused to plead guilty. He also refused, before he was arrested, to leave Hong Kong, when so many others in the dissident movement did, because he didn't want to, because he thought he needed to stand up for his principles. And of course, he was arrested and has suffered greatly for it. 5 years in prison, much of that in solitary confinement. The lone window in the cell blocked to block sunlight, gets an hour a day for exercise, and then he's escorted out, isolated in his cell. The guards in front that guarded 24/7 do not engage, according to his family, with him in any conversation. So he is really suffering. I should add that other Apple Daily executives received on Monday 6 or 7 year sentences after pleading guilty, no doubt in hopes of a lighter sentence. The Keir Starmer, Jimmy Lai, by the way, is a British citizen. And Joe, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of Britain, went to Beijing within the last 2 weeks. And he had said he would mention, and said he did mention, Jimmy Lai's fate to Xi Jinping, but absolutely no movement on that front that we've heard so far.
Right. So far as I can tell, and I mean, for better or worse, it looks like most of the international leverage in Jimmy's case is going to have to come from the U.S. and President Trump, because I think that Britain, not only under the current Prime Minister Keir Starmer, but under his predecessors from the Conservative Party, Starmer's of the Labour Party, have shown real trouble focusing on this case, particularly because I think that Britain experiences a lot of anxiety about its broader economic relationship with China. And, I think that it's actually worth rethinking that issue a little bit, because one of the things that I find so puzzling about the way foreign leaders, whether it's in Britain or potentially even in the US, think about this. I mean, you have to ask, what kind of regime is this scared of a 78-year-old man? Or what kind of regime is this frightened of a keychain, to go back to Bill's story about the courtroom? That is not a sign of strength from Beijing. I think that the broader context here is that there's a lot of anxiety on the part of the Communist Party about the economy in mainland China and the potential political implications for the party's rule, of the fact that the economy is running into some pretty serious problems. That anxiety expresses itself in this crackdown on a city that always existed outside of the mainland political system, that had this one country, two systems legal guarantee already, and that is only a few million people in a Chinese country with a population well over 1 billion. So they're unhappy about Hong Kong. They're worried about this. They're going after Jimmy because the Communist Party is experiencing all of these anxieties closer to home, and that should create an opening for a foreign leader, whether it is Keir Starmer or Donald Trump, to potentially apply a little pressure to do some good here.
Bill, President Trump visits China in April. He has been at pains in his public comments to say how great his relationship is with Xi Jinping. Are there any doubts in your mind that the ultimate decision on Jimmy Lai's fate lies with Xi Jinping?
No, not at all. Because that's from the start. This is shown. China's calling the shots. Hong Kong may initiate things, but if China didn't agree to them, they wouldn't get done. And that's what this trial has proved. Jimmy was convicted under the laws that China passed and imposed on Hong Kong. And the idea that Hong Kong could do something this important without China's okay it beggars belief. So I agree with Joe, and it all comes down to Donald Trump now. He's mentioned Jimmy a few times. He seems well disposed to him, but he says, I'll try, I'll raise this thing. We don't know how hard he'll push. I hope it's very hard for his release, and we don't know what China's thinking. Is it worth it? My own belief is that Trump would be doing China a favor to get Jimmy Lai off their plate, because the alternative is to let him serve out his sentence and die in prison. That can't be good for China. I mean, Jimmy's just been nominated again for the Nobel Prize. Doesn't mean he's going to get it, but 5 congressmen put him forward, and it's going to be a lot of stuff like that so long as he's kept in jail.
Nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, which I can't think of a more deserving recipient than Jimmy. And I take your point, Bill, about that if you look at it from a rational point of view, there's not much interest here. China has little interest in keeping Jimmy Lai in jail, given the negative press it entails, and will continue. And if he dies in prison, will get so much worse. But the question is, they may not care about that foreign. This may be, as Joe suggests, wholly about domestic precedent and the fact that they worry and have worried about the so-called infection from Hong Kong. Because remember, when I was in Hong Kong many years ago, a lot of the chit-chat in Hong Kong, the hopeful chatter was, remember, this was the heyday of Chinese reform, the mid-'80s. Deng Xiaoping was bringing market reforms and so on to the country. And the debate was, okay, is China going to take over Hong Kong and impose its dictatorial system? Or will China, Hong Kong, with its great example of prosperity and freedom, lead to essentially an intellectual takeover of China? Well, we know how that turned out.
Right.
And that was my expectation at the time, knowing what we have learned over the years about the communist system. So it may be that Xi Jinping doesn't give a damn what Donald Trump tells him. And he just thinks, well, this is a domestic issue, so go pound sand.
I think he doesn't care in the sense that he worries about the bad publicity or something. But the question is, does he want something that he could get in exchange? Does he want to drop Trump a bone in the negotiations? There's a lot of different factors in it, but he operates, as you say, on different set of principles, communist principles, and they don't care about like an old man dying or something. They've already had one Nobel laureate die in prison. They're risking another one. But I do think Donald Trump should point out to them that he would be doing them a favor, now they've boxed themselves in a corner. They've convicted him. They got to put him in jail for these 20 years. Is that it? Is that really in China's interest to have him die in prison and a broken old man? I'm not so sure it is. And I'm not so sure. We'll find out in negotiation. I doubt there'll be a straight tit for tat where they say, we'll give you this, you give us Jimmy Lai. It'll be a package deal, be part of other things wrapped up. But I do hope that Donald Trump pushes for it, because Jimmy was a real friend of the United States. In fact, that's half the charges against him. And he represents our values. And as you know, and you sat at his dinner table, he represents the values of the Wall Street Journal that we've been pushing, free markets and free men. His whole life, it's been a version of that.
And one of the counts against him in the trial, the evidence presented by the prosecutors was his association with a couple of our writers, you, Bill, and Julian Melcher, because of course Jimmy associated with journalists all the time. Nothing sinister about it, and he wrote in our publication from time to time. So, but in Hong Kong and China, that is deemed as subversive and somehow sedition. All right, let's say a prayer for Jimmy Lai and hope that he is released at some point here after the intervention of Donald Trump. We can hope so. And we will not lose sight of his case as the months and years go if he is not released. All right, let's turn to Japan's election, which was held Sunday and was a rout, landslide for the ruling Liberal Democratic Party and the new Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi. She, Japan's first female prime minister, she gambled on a snap election after only 3 months in office, Joe, but it paid off big, two-thirds majority, over a two-thirds majority in the lower house with the LDP and its coalition partners. That means the party will be able to overrule objections in the upper house, which is held by the opposition, and even propose changes in the Constitution. So what happened here? Why'd she win?
Well, I think that a lot of this seems to have to do with her own personal charisma. She's into pop and rock music. I think that she presents a new face of a party that has been around seemingly forever and can tend to be very boring and, historically has tended to produce a long string of relatively short-lived, nondescript prime ministers. And so I think that one thing that she has going for her is that she's just interesting. I think that counts for a lot in politics. It gives voters something to think about. And I think that what's really going on here is that her party, the LDP, has sort of been adrift really ever since Shinzo Abe left office, and then he was assassinated a few years after that. He had, when he was the prime minister, he had a really clearly articulated, easy to explain economic agenda to get Japan going again. And then after he left office, I think the LDP really struggled to catch that lightning in the bottle again. But Sanae Takaichi is a protege of Abe. She talks about her agenda oftentimes in some of the same ways, with the same degree of excitement and conviction that he did, and voters seem to have responded to that. We'll see how much of an agenda there is behind that. It's not clear to me that she has the same degree of conviction behind a certain set of policy ideas that her mentor, Shinzo Abe, did. But this at least starts to reverse the problem Japan had gotten into, where it didn't have any politicians who were particularly memorable or any parties that were capable of commanding a majority in the parliament. At least now she does have a mandate to do something if she wants to use it.
Well, what's striking here is the contrast with other Western political leaders who, they're all down in the polls, whether it be Germany, France, Britain, Donald Trump now struggling in the polls and maybe heading towards a midterm defeat. So she has something of a unique opportunity here. Bill, one question I wanted to ask you was whether this vote represented a rebuke to China by the Japanese electorate, because remember when Takaichi just come into office, she was asked about Taiwan, and she said, well, if China would take over Taiwan by force, that would be a big threat to Japan's security, and we may have to act to stop that. And China erupted and has since not only attacked her rhetorically, but it has withheld some rare earth minerals, tried to punish it through trade policy, and also by essentially saying Chinese should not visit Japan. And tourism to Japan, which has been dominated by Chinese, is way, way off. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it generally redounds to her benefit, because what she said is eminently true and obviously true. It would be a threat to Japan. I actually thought to the United States before. Once someone, I don't know who it was in World War II, referred to Taiwan as a land aircraft carrier. That's what its strategic importance is. So if China were to get control of that, it affect a lot of people, not just Japan and China, but South Korea and so forth. So what she said was true, and China pulled out all stops to get her to back down. So I'm glad she hasn't. We'll see where it plays out from here, but she showed a little mettle in that confrontation, and I think we can be grateful for it. And we should recognize the people that are like doing our work, taking stands for the same values and principles we do. We want Asia to be strong. We need Japan to be strong and Taiwan to be protected.
The conservative voters came home, Joe, looks like, to the LDP. And I think the national defense had partly to do with that. She's strong on defense. She will spend more on defense. She also said she's going to have a 2-year freeze on the 8% consumption tax on food and beverages. She wants some Keynesian spending programs to boost growth, which is, I think, not as hopeful as some of the other projects that on her agenda list. But the Nikkei average boomed on Monday. It was up nearly 4 percentage points, more than 2,000 points. Really a testament to the enthusiasm in Japan for the economy. On the other hand, Japanese bond yields popped up a bit, and that's, I think, a little concern about potential Japanese debt and whether they can finance all that spending.
Right. Well, a lot to unpack there. I mean, I think that probably one of the most consequential things that she can do is on the defense spending front. And this would definitely be a continuation of Shinzo Abe's big project, which was to push through various constitutional amendments, other legal changes, and a broader political change in the way that Japan thought about defense and the role of its military in the region, which was sort of finally shedding a lot of the legacy of the post-war era and understanding that Japan does need to take a more active strategic military role in the region. So I think that if she can do that, that's going to be very consequential. The U.S. would be a big beneficiary of Japan playing that role. Problem is she's going to have to pay for it. So she is promising increases in defense spending, which Japan desperately needs. But Paul, as you pointed out, her big weakness is her economic agenda, where she is missing the kind of ideas that Abe had about economic reform to really get the economy growing to the point where you have, economic activity that can support the kind of defense expenditure that Japan is going to need. And it's made all the more complicated by the fact that Japan has not been growing for such a long time. We're now well into their 4th lost decade since their bubble burst back in the late 80s, early 90s. That has created a lot of economic problems that have built up for them. So the phenomena with the rising bond yields that you flagged, I mean, part of that is market concern about her big spending agenda and where the growth would come from to pay for that. Part of it is just this natural process Japan is going to have to go through as it becomes a normal economy again after more than 30 years of very slow growth, very low interest rates, very low domestic investment. So she has a lot of needles that she's going to have to thread here. You can see a scenario where it works out really well, and we can hope that Japan is going to be the kind of economic and strategic and military partner a lot of us have hoped it would be for a long time. But she's going to have a lot of work to do to get there.
She is scheduled to visit the White House here in coming weeks, and she'll do so with an enhanced political standing at home. That should put her in good stead to be able to deal with President Trump on trade and other issues. And let's hope President Trump realizes this and stops treating Japan like some kind of economic adversary with high tariffs, and instead recognizes that it's fundamentally an ally and ought to be a partner on trade. We'll see if he can park those mercantile views that he has aside and think about the larger geostrategic interests in the Asia Pacific. All right. Thanks to Bill McGurn. Thanks to Joe Sternberg. Thank you all for listening. We're here every day on Potomac Watch.